and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on natural history collections and repatriation. When does NAGPRA apply? And NAGPRA, of course, is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. There have been some changes to NAGPRA's enacting regulations in the past year. So we will be talking about that and talking about NAGPRA in general, as well as getting into some examples during this webinar. So to start off, today's event is co-hosted by the American Institute of Biological Sciences, the Natural Science Collections Alliance, and the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections, and organized by an ad hoc planning committee of representatives from the 3 hosting organizations, as well as other interested members of the community. And this group of individuals basically came together with the goal of organizing an educational program on a topic that is extremely important and complex and requires thoughtful discussion and engagement. So we're glad that you're joining us live today and hope that you will share the recording of this program with your colleagues who are not able to join us today. And to introduce myself, my name is Jyotsna Pandey. I serve as the Community Programs Director for the American Institute of Biological Sciences, and Executive Director for the Natural Science Collections Alliance. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items to note. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the NSCA website. Please feel free to use the chat feature on Zoom today to share any comments you have and to introduce yourselves. We will have an audience Q&A session after the presentations. At that time, we will activate the Q&A feature on Zoom, so you may type in your questions for the speakers. If you would like to pose your question, or offer a comment verbally, we do have the ability to go ahead and unmute you. So let us know by just raising your hand. And finally, please contact my colleague Diane, who is our IT support for the program, via chat if you are experiencing any kind of technical difficulties. And with that, I am really pleased that we have 3 amazing speakers joining us today. We'll first hear from Melanie O'Brien, who is the manager and designated federal official for the National NAGPRA program at the National Park Service. Following Melanie will be Jan Bernstein, who is founder and managing director at Bernstein and Associates, NAGPRA consultant that is based in Denver, Colorado, and Chelsea Schrock, who is an associate and osteologist at Bernstein and Associates. I wanted to mention that we plan to have the voices of Native Americans represented in the second webinar of this series, but we would welcome hearing if any of the participants here have tribal affiliations in the chat. So without further ado, let's start with our first presentation from Melanie O'Brien, who will give us an overview of NAGPRA, what is covered under it, and tell us about recent changes and an upcoming deadline. Take it away, Melanie.
Thank you so much. It'll give me just a minute to start sharing my screen. All right, hopefully you can all see that.
Yes, that looks good. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. As I was introduced, I'm Melanie O'Brien. I am the manager of the National NAGPRA program. I am housed within the National Park Service, but my responsibilities are nationwide for administration and implementation of NAGPRA across the country. And one of my primary responsibilities is to provide assistance and guidance to museums, as well as Indian tribes and federal agencies on implementation of NAGPRA. So I've prepared a short presentation today to focus on the application of NAGPRA to natural history collections in particular, along with a couple of examples. If you aren't familiar with NAGPRA at all, you will be interested to know that the law was passed in 1990. So it's been around for almost 34 years. It was passed in November of 1990. And the citation for the act is at the top of the screen. If you're interested in actually reading the act itself, it's pretty short. And the law represented really a consensus and a compromise after several years of negotiation and activism around the issues of repatriation and in particular repatriation of ancestral remains as well as cultural items that were held by museums primarily. NAGPRA represents a change in the policy of the United States government on how Native American ancestors and objects are treated in this country. It puts certain obligations on museums in particular, as well as federal agencies, to change their process of holding Native American ancestors and objects. And it does that by recognizing fundamentally the rights of lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations in the human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony that may be housed in museum collections, but the rights to those items are with the lineal descendant Indian tribe or NHO that they belong to. That is what NAGPRA does. So that brings us to the regulations, which regulations provide additional guidance and information on the implementation of the law itself. And we have had regulations under NAGPRA in the Code of Federal Regulations in Part 10 of Chapter 40 of Title 43 since 1995. But in the last year, in January of 2024, there was a full revision of those regulations aimed at clarifying and simplifying the process for repatriation under NAGPRA. These regulations, as the law itself, apply to all museums, which is a broadly defined term under the law, and it also applies to federal agencies. And basically, under the law and the regulations, there are two different processes. There's one process for the protection of human remains and cultural items on federal or tribal land. And that's the part of NAGPRA we're not going to talk about today. The part we're going to talk about are the requirements for repatriation of human remains and cultural items by museums and federal agencies. So there are two important parts to NAGPRA, and it's important to know that they are separate and distinct. And we're going to focus today just on the second one, the repatriation requirements. So again, the repatriation requirements under the law and the regulations, and I've included here a citation to the regulation at the bottom, but also a link to our website where it describes this piece of the law and the regulations. And I believe the PowerPoints will be shared after the presentation. Again, the repatriation requirements apply to museums. And as I mentioned, that is a broadly defined term that includes any institution that receives federal funding. It also applies to federal agencies. And the law and the regulations require that certain information about Native American human remains and cultural items must be made available to lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or Native Hawaiian organizations. So what does this have to do with natural history collections? Well, you may be thinking it has very little to do with natural history collections. However, as the previous slide stated, there is an obligation for museums, as it's broadly defined, to ensure that they are making information available about any Native American human remains or cultural items in their collections. So regardless of what the title of the museum is or what the focus of your collections are, there is an obligation, if you receive federal funding, to make information about any Native American items or ancestors in your collection available. So what I've put here are some of the definitions that are helpful in understanding when NAGPRA applies. Native American, again, is a broadly defined term that means related to a tribe, people, or culture indigenous to the United States. So we may have some assumptions about what Native American means, but there is a definition under NAGPRA for what that means. If you have questions about whether your institution receives federal funds for purposes of NAGPRA, again, it's a broad definition of federal funds, and it can be either direct or indirect receipt of federal financial assistance after the passage of NAGPRA. generally, most museums in this country receive some kind of federal funding. Those that don't generally know very clearly that they do not and have not received any federal funding. This doesn't mean federal funding from the National NAGPRA program. It means federal funding from any federal agency, which can include the National Science Foundation, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts. Those are all federal funds that may be that qualify as receipt of federal funds for purposes of triggering NAGPRA obligations. And again, they can be direct or indirect. So if you are a part of a, say, a small county museum might receive federal funding through the larger county entity. And that would still qualify that county museum as receiving federal funds. And then the last part, the last two definitions to really think about here are human remains and cultural items. Those are the types of items in a collection that NAGPRA is focused on. And human remains is probably pretty self-evident, but it is any physical part of a body of a Native American individual. And this can include hair samples, tissue samples, other parts, physical parts of a body. And cultural items are those items that may be funerary objects, sacred objects, or objects of cultural patrimony. Those, again, are all defined terms, but the definitions are available in the regulations themselves, or you can get to them quickly through this glossary link. So what is required under NAGPRA? Again, as I said, the requirements for a museum is to ensure that it's communicating with Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations about the collection. And so there is an obligation for any museum that receives federal fund to ensure that they are reporting on any holdings or collections that may contain Native American human remains or cultural items. And those get reported either through a summary, an inventory, or in some cases where a museum only has custody of a collection, they would need to report those in a custody statement. And there are deadlines for all of this reporting. And a new deadline that came with these revisions in the regulations is for those museums that might have custody of a collection, especially a collection that might have come from federal land, where the museum doesn't have clear title or ownership to that collection, but the federal agency does. There is an obligation for museums to ensure that they are reporting that to the federal agencies, as well as to my office, the National NAGPRA program. So if you are the custodian of a collection that might have Native American human remains or cultural items, you also have an obligation under the new regulations. Another piece of the regulations that is new is this addition of a duty of care requirement. This applies to all Native American human remains or cultural items that are subject to NAGPRA, and it requires, again, a basic duty of care for caring, safeguarding, and preserving human remains and cultural items that are in a collection. But primary change, and one that you may have seen recent news stories about, is the third one, the requirement to obtain free, prior, and informed consent prior to allowing exhibition, access, or research on Native American human remains or cultural items. So this is a new piece to the NAGPRA regulations that requires that consent for exhibition, access, or research on, again, Native American human remains or cultural items. So the requirements for repatriation are to follow the step-by-step process to ensure that the museum is taking a good faith effort to make information available, offer to consult, and to respond to requests from Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations. There is, and has been since 1990, a requirement to incorporate information from consultation in decision-making under NAGPRA. And this is all, again, to that overarching intent of the law, which is to recognize the rights of lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and NHOs. So with the revised regulations, we've sort of reoriented the process into a step-by-step process. And we have a variety of tools like this one to kind of outline the different steps in the process. And this is the step-by-step process for repatriation of human remains in particular. And I'd like to follow that up with an example of a natural history collection that was repatriated under NAGPRA. In this case, the repatriation or the process of repatriation occurred in 2014. So I've put on the screen sort of an outline of the story and a link at the bottom for where you can access the full notice that tells the full story here. But the Illinois State Museum had 2 nests with eggs that had been built inside 2 human cranium. They were collected in the 1930s. In 1947, that collection of the nests, the eggs, and the human cranium were donated to the Illinois State Museum. In 2014, after consultation, the human remains were reported in an inventory of human remains and published in a notice of inventory completion. That's steps 4 and 5 under the regulations. The following month, in August of 2014, the human remains here were made available then for repatriation to Indian tribes. So then it allowed the Indian tribes that were connected to that human cranium, to the human craniums, to make those requests for repatriation under steps 6 through 8. So that's just a brief example for you. And again, you can use the Federal Register link to read the full story. The other process, again, is for repatriation of cultural items, and that's what the step-by-step process that's outlined here. So separate from human remains and associated funerary objects is the process for cultural items. And I have an example of that for you as well. This example comes from the University of Michigan, that in 1931, botanicals were collected during field work in the Rio Grande Valley. And in 1993, the University of Michigan sent invitations to consult to Indian tribes broadly about the collection, including botanicals in the collection. That's steps 1 through 2 in the process. At some point before July of 2023, consultation occurred, and the tribes made a request for repatriation of those botanicals. That's steps 3 through 5. In August of 2023, a notice was published, step 6. And again, you can find the full notice at the bottom of the screen. There's a URL there. And that made in September 2023, pardon me, 30 days after the notice was published, it meant that the botanicals were available to the tribes for repatriation. So it's important to think about NAGPRA as both a project of information sharing and transparency about collections, but also about decision making. And there are decisions that museums must make throughout this process. And those decisions must be informed by consultation and are spurred by a request for repatriation. And it's important to know that museums can determine not to repatriate. There are options under NAGPRA for a museum to evaluate a request and decide not to repatriate. The examples I've provided you are where the museum has said yes, but there is a process built out through these regulations where a museum can say, no, the request doesn't satisfy the criteria. And in that case, the museum must provide an opportunity for the requester to give more information to support their request. There are also 2 other ways that the process may be interrupted or disrupted, I should say. There is an option for a museum to make an assertion of what's called a right of possession, particularly for cultural items in a collection. This is a very particular defined term and has to do with how the museum originally acquired the item, whether or not it can make that assertion of a right of possession and prove that it has that right of possession, but that is the one way that a museum may deny a request for repatriation. In addition to that, there are times where there are competing requests for repatriation, and there is an obligation for museums in those cases to make a determination of the most appropriate requester. What happens if you don't do any of this? Well, there are criminal provisions under NAGPRA where human remains or cultural items are sold or used for profit. In addition, there are civil penalties that could be assessed under NAGPRA for failing to comply with these requirements. There is a federal advisory review committee that monitors and reviews the implementation of NAGPRA. And grants are not awarded to a museum that has not complied with NAGPRA. So a little more about the last two. The review committee is a federal advisory committee that has a balanced membership between Indian tribes and museum and scientific organizations. And I'll point out here that NSCA has in the past nominated members who have served on this review committee, and that's seen here on the screen. The review committee findings are advisory only, but their findings and transcripts are admissible in court. So there's a significance to a request to a review committee or a finding of the review committee in terms of additional court action that might come from a disagreement. And then the last slide here is grants, as I mentioned, are available as a means of complying with NAGPRA and consulting on collections and identifying objects for repatriation. We have two different kinds of grant programs, one for project and consultation grants, and the other for repatriation grants. Repatriation grants being the transfer, the physical transfer piece. And I just did a quick search of our grants for those that had the word natural in it. So it's not an exhaustive list, certainly, of museums that are connected to any of these organizations, but it's a quick snapshot of some of the museums that have the word nature or natural in their title that have been recipients of NAGPRA grants. And you can see there are quite some large sums there that different museums have been awarded to complete these requirements under NAGPRA. And so with that, I will stop sharing and I will hand it over to Jan.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I am going to hopefully share the right screen here. Can you all see the PowerPoint? Great. I am going to move a couple of screens around so I can see you all and talk to you at the same time. There we go. I'm Jan Bernstein. I am the founder and managing director of Bernstein and Associates, NAGPRA Consultants, and I have been facilitating repatriation since before NAGPRA, since the mid-1980s. And I will invite Chelsea to say hello.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chelsea Schrock. I'm an associate with Bernstein and Associates NAGPRA Consultants, and I'm also an osteologist. I've been working with Bernstein and Associates for almost 3 years now, and I have been fortunate enough to identify almost 1,000 people as I've been with Bernstein and Associates and helped them get home. So as the osteologist at BNA, I do on-site audits to assist our clients with identifying potential individuals that fall under NAGPRA within their collections across campuses. Prior to those audits, our clients will send out surveys to department heads and ask them to report on all collections. And what we found is that many academic institutions do not have complete intellectual control over their collections. And while the surveys and audits did start out as a way to gain intellectual control over what may be covered by NAGPRA, it turned into a way of giving institutions, full intellectual control, to gain that intellectual control over their collections, no matter what the collections are. So today, Jan and I will be discussing a few examples of individuals who were found in departments outside of anthropology. In the early 1900s, human remains representing at minimum 4 individuals were removed from a field on the Princeton University campus in Princeton, Mercer County, New Jersey. George H. Shull, a professor of botany at Princeton, removed the individuals from a field, which was plowed each spring for him to conduct his botanical experiments.
On an unknown date, Native American human remains belonging to at minimum 1 individual were removed from Lake Worth, Palm Beach County, Florida. In 1930, the individual was gifted by D. Stewart Jr. to Brown University's Department of Geology. On an unknown date, Native American human remains representing at minimum 1 individual were removed from a gravel pit at Mount Sterling, Madison County, Ohio. Colin Hyde, presumably a Beloit College alum of the class of 1913, donated the individual to the geology department of Beloit College.
Human remains representing at minimum 1 individual were removed from an unknown county in California. The V. Basinger collection, which housed this individual, is believed to have been donated to UC Riverside in the 60s, and a professor of entomology named Dr. Almond J. Basinger, who taught at UC Riverside, was married to Vera Basinger. The institution believes that the collection was donated by Dr. Almond after Vera's passing.
On an unknown date, Native American human remains representing at minimum 1 individual were removed from an unknown location in Henry County, Indiana. In 2004, Princeton transferred the now defunct Princeton Museum of Natural History Paleontology collection to Yale University. On July 30th, 2008, someone at Yale identified human remains among the transferred collection and alerted Princeton. During the week of February 10th, 2020, Princeton retook physical custody of the individual.
In November of 1938, human remains representing at least 1 individual were removed from a shell mound near the Point Reyes Coast Guard Station in Marin County, California, by Lloyd Travis Jr., who is a well-known biologist. The individuals were put in the collection of Milton Hildebrand, a graduate student at UC Berkeley's Museum of Vertebrate Zoology in the 1940s. And when Hildebrand went to UC Davis to teach in the zoology department, not Zooark, he created his own teaching collection for comparative anatomy. In the 1980s, after he retired, Hildebrand gave his collections to the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UCB.
In 1920, sorry, I'm not that old. In 2021, during an on-site audit that I was conducting, what was purported to be a collection of unmodified shell and fishbone turned out to be a collection that included Native American human remains representing at minimum 103 individuals, nearly 11,000 associated funerary objects, nearly 1,400 unassociated funerary objects, 4 sacred objects, and 123 objects of cultural patrimony, as well as 3 unspecified cultural items. So how did that come about? Well, in brief, sometime between 1947 and 1976, the ancestors and items, cultural items, were excavated and otherwise removed from various locations by Dr. Carl Levitt Hubbs, as well as members of his collecting party. From 1944 to 1969, Dr. Hubbs taught biology at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego in La Jolla. The ancestors and cultural items were incorporated into what became known as the Hubbs Collection. In 1973, Dr. Hubbs bequeathed the hub's collection to the Museum of Us, which at the time was the San Diego Museum of Man. In March 2004, the Museum of Us deaccessioned the hub's collection and donated it to the University of San Diego Anthropology Department. However, some of the collection remained at Museum of Us for an unknown reason. Given the scope of the collection and complexities related to control and possession, the University of California, San Diego, the Museum of Us, and the University of San Diego agreed to work together to facilitate NAGPRA compliance in collaboration with the tribes who were believed to have an interest. So you are not alone. In addition to the National NAGPRA program, there are training opportunities through the National NAGPRA program, as well as National Preservation Institute, Beloit College's Center for Collections Care, known as C3, and the InStep program run through University of Illinois and Indiana. There are also communities of practice. The National NAGPRA Community of Practice has twice monthly meetings that are open to anyone. And there's a federal agency, NAGPRA Community of Practice, California Repatriation Community, Midwest, Nebraska, Northeast, Wisconsin has its own, the Southeast has one. The Southwest has one that used to be the Colorado group, is now the Southwest group. And then there is the Association on American Indian Affairs Tribal Partners Working Group, and they're also now providing training in NAGPRA. And there's a Cahokia Working Group and Split and Shared Collections Project. Thank you very much for participating in our talk, and I will hand it back over to our hosts.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan and Chelsea and Melanie, for your presentations and for sharing all that great information. Very helpful. We will now move into our Q&A and discussion portion of the program. Helping us moderate the discussion are two members of our webinar planning committee. Trina Roberts is Associate Vice President for Collections at the Natural History Museum of LA County. Trina is also the Vice President of NSCA. And Breda Zimkus is the Director of Collections Operations at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. Breda also co-chairs the Spinach Legislation and Regulations Committee. So take it away, Trina and Breda. And as a reminder, the audience should not be able to post or type in your questions into the Q&A feature over Zoom.
We did have one question in the chat, and it might be worth taking that one first. Does this apply only to federally recognized tribes, e.g., can only federally recognized tribes request repatriation and or accept collections available for repatriation? Melanie, that's probably for you.
Yep, it is. Yes, it does only apply to federally recognized tribes. In the past, there have been avenues for repatriation to non-federally recognized groups. And the main path for that still exists, and that is through a partnership with a federally recognized tribe. We've seen that be a very successful way that groups that are not recognized can achieve repatriation by partnering or working with a federally recognized tribe. But there is no direct path under NAGPRA for repatriation to a non-federally recognized group. But there are still plenty of success stories where the tribes can work with federally recognized tribes to achieve that.
Great, thank you.
So we have an anonymous question in the Q&A. Some non-human animal remains might be archaeological in nature and found in a location that is not associated with habitation and or burials. That material is outside the scope of NAGPRA. Other non-human animal remains may be archaeological and from Native American sites such as a village, but not directly associated with a burial. Is this material within the purview of NAGPRA?
think that's for me again. I would say that in either description, there is a possibility that the animal remains could be covered by NAGPRA. And what it depends on really is consultation. So we have seen a number of examples where animal remains that are archaeological in nature may be considered by a tribe to be objects of cultural patrimony or sacred objects, and therefore subject to repatriation under NAGPRA. Now, that's not true in every case, and it's going to depend largely on the circumstances and the information available about the animal remains, and it's going to depend on consultation. Again, the objective here is to share information about collections that a tribe may have an interest in, and to have those conversations about whether or not the tribe wants to seek repatriation of animal remains from a variety of circumstances.
Great. Our next question from Lisa is, what constitutes good faith effort on the informational or front end of our collections?
Yeah, that's really not an easy question to answer, except to say good faith means that you are communicating and sharing information to the best of your ability. And so that's what is required. The sharing of information is a clear requirement under NAGPRA. Sharing information and contacting tribes to let them to make sure they're aware of the collections that you hold. There is no requirement for repeated invitations to consult or information sharing, but there is an initial obligation for a museum to ensure that it's notified tribes of collections that the tribes might have a potential interest in.
A second part to her question are, what may be the reasons for denial for repatriating a cultural item?
Yeah. So a request for repatriation needs to assert that an object meets one of the definitions under NAGPRA. A definition of a specific kind of cultural item. For example, a sacred object has a specific definition under NAGPRA, and the request for an item as a sacred object needs to identify those components of the definition. Where it doesn't, and where the information available shows that this object does not meet that definition, then those are reasons why a request for repatriation may be denied. I will say that the other one that I pointed to in my presentation is that very particular case of a right of possession, where a museum can assert and in fact must prove that it acquired the item with the voluntary consent of the individual who could give it. So it's a very particular piece of NAGPRA, but does provide, again, another avenue for denying repatriation of a cultural item.
We have quite a few questions in the Q&A about plants and herbarium specimens. So I'm gonna use one of those and hope that gets at some of the others as well. One of the examples was about the repatriation of botanicals. What leads to botanical materials being under the purview of NAGPRA as opposed to just being an herbarium specimen if it wasn't collected in an anthropological context? Would any collection of a species that has ceremonial significance fall under NAGPRA, or any collection of a species with ceremonial significance that was collected from land that was or is now tribally owned? Would any collection of plant materials from tribally owned lands fall under NAGPRA? And maybe just to answer some of these questions, a little bit more description of what kinds of botanical materials are being thought about in this context.
So to answer the question, really it's the answer to the question depends on consultation. And it depends on the request of a tribe for a certain item. However you might categorize that item within the museum, it isn't necessarily relevant to how the tribe may perceive that item and therefore want to make the request for repatriation. So, I can't really say exactly what kinds of botanicals are subject to NAGPRA. There is a potential for any collection to be of interest to a tribe and to be something the tribe wants to request repatriation of. Now, this is where it gets to the need to work through this process. And the process, again, requires transparency about the collection. And again, broad general information that you have botanical material is sufficient to make that initial sharing of information. And then it goes to the consultation process. And if the tribe is interested in making a request under NAGPRA for something in your collection.
We have a question about whether universities are working towards providing master lists of all potentially NAGPRA holdings across departments to National NAGPRA. Do tribes need to approach each department?
I can start that answer. One of our first slides was on surveys and audits. And as Chelsea mentioned, we are doing more and more of those. So that the universities and colleges can get intellectual control of all of the collections. And then decisions can be made about which items may be covered by NAGPRA. And then the university or college is sending out the summary or the invitation to consult about ancestors. And so we urge our academic clients to do this from the highest level possible at the institution, because it is the institution's responsibility to comply with NAGPRA, not the department's responsibility. And I think in the past, decades ago, it was left to the department sometimes, and the administration eventually didn't even realize the compliance or non-compliance was occurring. So I urge everyone to bring this to leadership, risk managers, attorneys.
Great, thank you.
So we have a question that was asked about plants, but is possibly could be broader. What if your collection is very, very large and has not been databased completely, and therefore it is not known if you have specimens or objects of interest?
Yeah, that's a good question. You are obligated as a museum to look at what you know about your collection and the potential for it to contain NAGPRA items. That is your obligation. If you look at the history of your institution and the general contents of your collection, and you decide, you being the museum, decide that nothing here is potentially a cultural item under NAGPRA, then you don't have obligations under NAGPRA. You do have to respond if somebody comes and asks to see something and wants to ask you questions about that decision. You do have those obligations to communicate and to talk with somebody that wants to learn more about your collection. However, you can make the decision that there's nothing in your collection that would be subject to NAGPRA, and therefore you don't have any NAGPRA obligations to report any of your collection. That's not the safest path. If you want to be very risk averse, if your administration wants to ensure that you're not going to have an allegation of a civil penalty alleged against you, or that you're not going to be the subject of a news story, then you might want to consider sending a letter. And that's all that's required, is to send a letter about the scope of your collections to tribes that may have an interest in it. It's an easy solution to prevent a potential failure. Trina, I just wanted to go back. There was a part of the previous question you asked on plants that I wanted to be sure I clarified. And the question was about, what if they came from tribal land or not tribal land? the location of removal is immaterial in this repatriation process. However, of course, it's important information about where something came from, because that's going to help identify the tribes that have a potential interest in it. But whether it was removed from tribal land, whether it was removed from federal land, or whether it was removed from private land, it is somewhat immaterial here when it comes down to, is it subject to NAGPRA?
There's a somewhat related question to that. If you don't have locality data for objects, how do you determine where the object should be repatriated?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, the first obligation is to identify if a tribe has a potential interest in the object, and if so, you may need to share information about your collection with all tribes if you don't have a location identification. Hopefully, you know whether it's from the continental United States, Alaska, or Hawaii, because that will really help if you can at least narrow that down. But even in some collections, that's not possible either. We do advise that the location of the collection is an important piece of information. So don't forget that these collections are generally pretty old. You probably know something about who created the collection and why. And it may be that the location of the institution itself, the location of the collection, is where you start in terms of talking with tribes about the collection.
We have an interesting question about how might you deal with something like soil samples collected from archaeological sites, which also had items that previously might have been considered naturally shed, like a child's teeth and placentae. These samples do have some bone in them, but have not been analyzed and are from a different area of the site. Should these then go to consultation along with human remains as well in good faith?
Yes, absolutely. If they are physical parts of a human body, and you can identify that they are likely Native American, they should be reported under NAGPRA.
One of our attendees is asking which, if any, professional standards should we look up to satisfy the NAGPRA duty of care, storage, treatment, or handling of human remains or cultural items?
Yeah, so there are any number of professional standards that you can look to when it comes to care of collections, and certainly ethical care of collections, in addition to the basic duty of care. I know that the Society for American Archaeology, the American Anthropological Association, as well as the American Alliance for Museums, have guidelines and ethics that pertain to this. But any organization would be useful in looking at how your policies might be adapted to ensure that ethical and cultural care is being implemented.
We have a question, a kind of procedural question. Since we only have to send a list of what is in our collections once, and our collections are always growing and changing and are quite large, is there any penalty for not providing a complete list of what we have? And maybe I'll add to that, and keeping that list updated as the collection changes.
Yeah, so the law and the regulations put a priority on human remains and the funerary objects that go with those human remains. So where there are human remains involved, yes, you must produce a list of those human remains, and it must be updated if you identify additional human remains. So again, the priority here on human remains is because of the general priority that we put on all human remains, and that they can be cared for and safeguarded by their relatives and their descendants. So that's why this priority on human remains. For other items, our advice is always to be as broad as possible in describing your collection, so that if you do have additional items that are brought to your museum, as long as you adequately described the scope of your collections or the scope of your collecting practices, that initial effort to invite consultation is sufficient. It's interesting to note that in the original drafts of NAGPRA, an itemized list was going to be required for all collections, every item in a collection. In the very end of passing NAGPRA, Congress removed that requirement and only put the priority on human remains to be itemized in a list. So it's important to keep in mind that there is a different level of detail required here.
And Melanie, it's my understanding that the American Association of Museums, now the American Alliance of Museums, was instrumental in having that changed because they said it would bankrupt museums and shift all focus over to trying to comply with that requirement. And they would have to cease operation in all other areas potentially in order to get those itemized lists completed.
I see a few questions that have to do with kind of the definition of what a sacred object is and what is sacredness, and concerns, that we have so many objects in our collections, and if they're all considered sacred, how can we deal with this consultation process?
So the easiest answer to this question is to consult, is to talk about what you have in your collections and what interests tribes have or might have in that collection. Because the more information that you can share about your collection and with tribes, and the more transparent you can be about the content of your collections, the better the process is going to go. And so whether you have one item or 100,000 items in your collection, the best thing you can do is talk about the collection and to help tribes identify if there's anything in your collections that they do want to talk more about. Because that's what NAGPRA really is. It's about a continuing conversation about the items in your collections and the interests of the tribes. And it may be that you're never going to get to the decision-making point. You may never get to a place where a tribe says, yes, this item or these types of items are sacred items and we want to make a request. But you might, and then there's a process for that. But a lot of times what we see with NAGPRA is the overwhelming fear of how do we consult on our entire collection if it's so large. And the answer is you do it by starting the process, by sharing information about what you do have and sharing what you know. And that can be difficult too, because so many times museums may not have a lot of intellectual control over their collections. We know that. So your obligation here is to share what you do know and to share what information you do have. In terms of the definition of sacred object, it is an object that is needed to practice a traditional religion by present day adherents. But that definition can and will vary greatly. Congress said when they passed NAGPRA that they were fully aware that every tribe, village, and community is going to have a different approach to what is a sacred object and what is needed to continue a religious practice. And so that's where, again, the talking about this and starting the conversation is so important.
And I'll just add to that, once you have submitted that summary, that general description of the collection, describing items that may be cultural items, you've done the inventory provision process. If there are ancestors, you're in compliance with NAGPRA, and then you can apply for a NAGPRA consultation documentation grant, working with tribal partners. Together, you can decide what part of a collection is a priority to better document. And then you can actually improve your intellectual control over that segment of the collection, because maybe it's going to be a databasing project or a photography and databasing project, so that everyone, all the tribes and all the elders who need to be consulted about this will have access to this information. And then the museum will benefit from that as well, because you'll have improved information about the collection.
That's a great segue to a question asked by someone in the Q&A about digital information, which has now scrolled off of my screen. When physical material is repatriated, what should the collecting institution do with digital information held? For example, the digital record in a collection management system, or images of something like herbarium sheets.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a good segue maybe to wrapping up. We're 5 minutes away, is that right? Okay. It's a good segue because NAGPRA is only going to cover the human remains or cultural items themselves. It's not going to tell you what has to happen to that data or the information. And this is where I always say that you have such an opportunity then in looking at how you want to build the relationship with tribes about the data, information, or about the rest of your collection. Because NAGPRA, sometimes I say NAGPRA is like a gateway drug to relationship building, in that this is the path you start to build a better relationship that can have so many far-reaching impacts and positive impacts on your museum and on your collection. And I think that's a good segue to the next webinar that's going to focus more on those positive outcomes outside of the repatriation process.
All right. Oh, sorry, somebody was saying something.
I was saying, just as you're pulling up the slide, there is one question that follows that, and it would be a perfect ending. What would you suggest as a good first step for museums to begin cultivating strong, healthy relationships with tribal communities and dispel any of the anxiety about consultation?
Yeah, lately I've been answering this question with the immortal words of Vanilla Ice. Stop, collaborate, and listen. It's the best thing that you can do. Stop worrying about it. That's stopping. Collaborate, start a conversation, whether it's by email, whether it's by phone, or whether it's in a physical meeting, and then listen.
Thank you. Thanks, Melanie and Jan and Chelsea. And thank you to our moderators as well. So unfortunately, we have come to the end of our program today, and we can clearly see that there are a lot of questions on this topic that, many that we weren't able to get to today, but clearly we need to have a lot more discussion on this. And there is a lot more to repatriation than what is covered under NAGPRA. So we're planning to hold another webinar in the spring of 2025 when we're hoping to sort of share additional examples of repatriation. Somebody brought up seeds in the Q&A. We are planning to feature examples from sort of the seeds collections perspective, and examples that are not necessarily covered by NAGPRA, and then delve further into discussions. We firmly believe that this topic requires continued engagement between the collections and tribal communities, and we're interested in keeping these discussions going through additional webinars and as well as workshops at conferences in the future. So do stay tuned. We will share details about the second webinar with you all when it's available, but you may also check back on the NSCA website early next year. The slides and recording from today will also be posted there and shared with you via email in a few days. But yeah, I just want to end by thanking our speakers again, the moderators, the rest of the planning committee that you can see on your screens, as well as all the attendees for joining the program today. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.